So first of all, thank you guys for being here today, and Shelley, thank you for inviting me, because this is a real privilege. When I was thinking about what this panel was, I guess the first question I would put to you guys is, what actually does cross-platform mean? Because it sort of implies that you're starting from some legacy platform of TV and then branching from there to other stuff. But there's an awful lot of content where TV is not part of this equation at all. Vice, for example, that you were talking about before. But how do you think about the term cross-platform versus just digital?
For us, CW is the newest broadcast network. We've been in business for 9 years. We're also the youngest one. Our average age is 38 for broadcast and 22 for digital. And very, very early on, we realized if we put ourselves in the traditional TV corner and just called it TV and computer and mobile, we would be in trouble. And so very early on, we said a screen is a screen, and what is important is that the consumer is watching where they want, how they want, and when they want. So for us, yes, TV is the mothership, but ultimately, they're all the same to us. We charge the same CPM across every one of the platforms, and our goal is just to be wherever the consumer is, providing them the product they want.
And we have kind of a similar way of looking at it, where it's we try and create a simple explanation for it and then test that. But it's really any place that a consumer wants to consume content. We create content through companies that we own, like Group Entertainment, investments we have in Vice and Weinstein Company, and then we also place ads in that content. So we want to understand what consumers are doing while they consume that, and that could be anywhere from a gas pump to a handheld phone.
Well, so now both of you are starting from the consumer side, and I really think about this as having two separate elements, obviously. One is serving the consumer and where does the consumer want to consume it, and then second, serving the advertiser and what the advertiser's needs are. I'm going to come back to the advertiser in a second. When I think about the consumer, and Rick, you, with your CW hat on for a second, when you think about going cross-platform, first of all, are you thinking about as holistically as a network? Are you thinking about individual shows? Are you thinking about individual clips of shows? How much do you disaggregate the network itself as you start to think about the customer experience cross-platform?
Sure. I mean, we look at all of the things that you talked about, and what's very interesting for us is every show has its own ecosystem, and every show is viewed very, very differently. One of the things that 77% of our content is not viewed live. We are probably the largest non-live viewed broadcast network, and so what that means is that we need to make sure that we're providing the opportunity for those people that don't watch it on TV as first choice. A lot of our shows are second choice, that we're there where we need to be. An example is America's Next Top Model, for instance. 70% of digital is done on mobile, and so what we do is that we make sure that we give them mobile, and we also provide them other opportunities on mobile that we don't other shows, because it is not as viable or as necessary for the consumer for other shows.
And how do you balance the challenge of existing distributors as you think about retransmission consent negotiations, where there is an argument coming from your counterparty, we want scarcity? How do you balance that?
Well, the great news for us is we don't have to worry about retrans. So that is one of the things that is a disadvantage from a monetary perspective, but is certainly an advantage from a consumer perspective, and we don't have to worry about the scarcity that other networks do, and we definitely take advantage of that.
And now let's turn to the advertiser for a second. I mean, one of the interesting conversations, you and I were talking a bit last night about the advertiser perspective in all of this. First, here to me is the big existential question. All of these platforms are much better targeted than traditional TV has been. Is that good news or bad news? Is that inflationary to CPMs, or is that deflationary to CPMs? And how do you think about where the dollars go for the ad buyers that you work with?
I think the answer is yes. It can be inflationary and also deflationary. It really depends on the client. I mean, we've kind of shifted from looking at reach only as a metric to outcomes, starting at the end and working backward, what we learned from search. But I think, in some cases it will be deflationary. In other cases it will inflate. So if you can maintain scarcity of a certain piece of content and that content is valued by consumers, then the price is going to go up, particularly as the audience continues to fragment. Because if you think about it, what we're experiencing now is kind of this inversion of scale where we used to access scale from the top. We would come in and, years ago, even the days before CW, we used to spend on 3 television networks and that was quite easy. So we used to access scale. Now we're aggregating scale. So we come in from the bottom and we put all of these things together. So in some cases that, that process will inflate CPM slightly. In other cases it will deflate it.
One of the challenges and we had this conversation a bit last night, one of the challenges I've been grappling with conceptually is the technology to enable better targeting also potentially enables lots of arbitrage. In that we tend to think about the demand side. What would you, or as an advertiser, what would I be willing to pay to reach exactly the same customer? Instead of thinking about the supply side, which is what are all the different venues that can now sell me that precise customer now that the information has effectively caught up. My suspicion, and challenge me if you think I'm wrong, my suspicion is that arbitrage function will end up overtaking that is the supply side, will end up overtaking the demand side. And targeting intuitively is higher CPMs, but in practice will end up being lower CPMs. Agree or disagree?
That's a pretty big, even more existential question. I think that if you look at what we do as a media trading organization, we've always created what we think of as secondary currencies against audiences. So if we use Nielsen, and there was a fair bit of Nielsen bashing yesterday, or Nielsen frustration that came out yesterday, but I think that as a trading currency in a market has helped the television market grow. At the same time, we look at Nielsen and say, well, that's one way of looking at the world, but we have clients who have a bunch of different kind of metrics behind that, and we're creating these secondary currencies and indexing, and if you think about broadcast specifically, indexing shows on television against those specific metrics. We do it also in general video that's not distributed onto a large screen. So we're doing that actually in more ways than we used to have to do it. So I think it's going back to what I said earlier. I think it's both inflationary and deflationary depending on the situation.
And Rick, how sophisticated are the ad buyers in the measurements that they're using and demanding?
Please say we're really sophisticated. Please say we're really sophisticated.
Incredibly so.
Thank you.
No, I think right now we're going through a transition, really trying to figure out what big data means and how we best can use it. And quite frankly, we're trying to figure out what is it that we can give the advertisers that's going to be currency for them that they're going to be able to take and understand. I've got to tell you that 9 out of 10 meetings that we're taking now from outside vendors is about big data and which one we want to go with and which one the media companies are going with. And right now, I think it's a free-for-all. The other thing that I want to just talk about and throw out to the audience is there is another currency that's a little bit more intangible, but we're seeing some interesting things on it, and that is kind of a psychographic or being part of the zeitgeist. And a perfect example of that is we have a show called Jane the Virgin. Jane the Virgin is won a lot of awards. Gina Rodriguez, who is the star of the show, is definitely in the zeitgeist, and yet that show is not the highest rated of our shows, and yet it is the most sought after of our shows. So what's interesting to me is, yes,
so a real premium for real engagement as opposed to just reach.
Right, for being in the zeitgeist and being part of the conversation.
You're also getting a significant amount of PR value out of that show as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
so it's interesting, and I think that is something that sometimes is not put into the equation, but needs to be.
So I want to rewind a little bit, because when I was talking about this panel with Shelley, he made some really interesting points about let's get past the high-level kind of generics of the strategy and really think about the nitty-gritty details of how this stuff actually happens. So I want to start with what sounds like a relatively simple thing, which is the decision-making process of how do you decide what you make available on cross-platform. And then once you've made that decision, what are all the things that follow on from that with respect to the contractual obligations, all of the rights issues, the digitization and the costs associated with the nitty-gritty detail of making this happen? Jack, why don't I start with you as to sort of how when you think about those moments?
We used to say that content is king, distribution is King Kong. Now we say content is king, distribution is hard, because it involves things like breaking apart pieces of content into smaller pieces of content. It involves creating kind of meta content around the things that we used to make and making that available again on multiple platforms. The struggle that we have always is in the measuring part of it. So it's almost like, we think about media technology and data as having merged, but we're still dragging the industry toward a way to effectively measure what we're distributing, and that's quite hard, and it has an impact not just on the media and content creators, but things like the Guild, right? So how do you count all these things, all these plays, and what's the storage cost if you push a 4K file that's 100 gig out to the edge and make it available, but it only gets watched once a year by someone who's sitting in Mexico.
And practically speaking, how many versions of a digital file do you need to have for all the different platforms that it might be played back on? It's not as simple as saying I just digitally encode it and there's one in it.
Yeah, I mean, right now, and this is just an example of, I'm out buying media right now for Jane the Virgin and Flash, and I have over 400 different versions of each one of those advertisements that I've bought, whether it be from a digital, a cable operator. So over 400 for the same piece of
Do you have a
creative.
magical transcoder that you take the master file and you put in, and then all of a sudden it comes out the other end?
Yes, her name is Melissa. So yeah, no, it is an incredibly time-consuming, and each year getting more and more so. And I wish it were as easy as an Excel sheet, and that would be great when that happens. But right now, it is a manual effort.
Yeah, and if you think about once that piece of content goes out, we're inserting ads into it, or working with partners who are inserting ads into it, and we're trying to measure it. So that makes it even more complex because one ad might cut across multiple pieces of content and run in one platform, but not run in another, and have a different we have a different ability to measure in one place versus another. And by the way, it's different in every single market. So if you look globally, it gets even more complex when you look at China, for example, where here we think about Netflix and others, but there we have a completely different set of technologies and companies that we're dealing with to not just create, but also distribute the content.
And so now you also have very different calculus, I would think, if you're talking about new content, where the content as it's being produced typically anticipates in the contractual arrangements with all the way from talent and all the way through digital distribution, to legacy content where the rights issues may be actually quite ambiguous, right? What is the process from, let's take a piece of legacy content, from the time that you decide that, okay, we need to make this content available? What's the process for actually getting that through all of the various hoops?
From our end, obviously, we only license the product. We do not own most of our product. So we deal with the studios, and the studios are kind of the guard keepers as to what the rules and regulations are in terms of what we can and can't do. And what's very interesting in some of the legacy product, as you call it, and some examples I'm going to give you are Whose Line Is It Anyway? We own all the classic versions of that. But there are 10 pieces within that that are forbidden to go up on digital. And it's those little nuances that you really don't know when you buy something that when you dig in, you start discovering. And that probably, and I don't know this for sure, but I think it probably has to do with who the guest stars were on those 10 and the rights that they gave them at that time.
Interesting. You always hear that TV Everywhere has been a flop, in part because the operators failed to anticipate the complexity of the rights issues and that sort of thing. But one of the challenges is the customer expectation when you start and your name is Comcast is deliver what Comcast has. The customer expectation when your name is Netflix is deliver what Netflix has. And so Netflix is driven by what can we get that fits the model, and Comcast is how do we try to take what we have and make it fit the model. And the second isn't arguably a much harder proposition. And so I have some sympathy for that challenge because those rights issues are so complicated.
Even, I mean, there are even accounting issues. So if you look at Netflix, for example, I think it was 2 years ago that they decided to change the way they're amortizing the new content as they put it out. It was in 2013, so I think it was a straight linear amortization of that. So it's not just, I mean, there are all sorts of things down to, how do you account for this content that you own, even when it's a brand new piece of content that we don't quite know yet, we haven't quite figured out in sufficient detail, and certainly we're working through it all, but it does make it challenging, particularly if you come out and you call something TV everywhere. You're creating an expectation that it's, okay, everything everywhere.
And it ain't that.
Not always,
Yeah.
not always.
TV almost everywhere.
Yeah, TV almost
That's
everywhere.
the problem.
So staying with that subject for a second of transitioning the TV model, as an observer of the cord-cutting phenomenon and a writer about it for an awful lot of years, I think everyone is aware that the pace of cord cutting actually has finally caught up or started to catch up a little bit with the hype around cord cutting. But it seems to me that there are two fundamentally different schools of thought out there. One is that the Sling TVs, the Sony PlayStation Views, from a lot of what has been written about Apple, is trying to take the existing TV ecosystem, reslice it and redice it into different packages and deliver those same packages online, whether it's over mobile devices or desktop laptops. There's a completely different school of thought that says the content itself is going to be completely different, and it's not going to be a repackaging of the same shows and the same networks. It's going to be Vice TV. It's going to be purpose-built stuff where the production cost is much lower, and therefore where the price to the end user is lower. Which of those two things resonates more with you? Do you think that the cross-platform revolution is primarily going to be driven by the traditional companies taking their content outside of the traditional ecosystem, or is it going to be all new companies creating all new models?
I think it's going to be both. I don't think it's one or the other here. But if you think about, I think the latest data reps, 40% of consumers upload, at least in North America, upload video at least once a week onto a social network. But your wedding video is not The Godfather. So one interesting thing that I observed, there was a show called Alone, which was a survival reality show that ran on, I think it was ran on the History Channel. And basically the premise is you drop people onto Vancouver Island, and they try and survive for a certain period of time, and the last person standing wins. I was amazed at the quality of which these folks were self-shooting, because they're dropped out with a set of camera equipment, some GoPros, and they shoot themselves. And the quality of their own production on that, I don't know what sort of film school they put them through, but it was quite remarkable. So we're seeing not just the quality of the prosumer video and the equipment getting better, but we're also seeing a much better aesthetic from individual consumers, but we still haven't closed that gap to The Godfather yet.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're absolutely betting on both. We've recently launched an over-the-top exclusive digital channel, CW Seed. Production value is, I think, almost as good, but production costs are dramatically cheaper. And what we really believe in is we want ubiquity in platform, but exclusivity in channel is really kind of where we're trying to head.
And so it's a good place to leave it because we're just about out of time. So give me a closing thought from each of you about 5 years from now. What does the concept of a television network look like?
I think the television network is a combination of a curator, a remixer, and a creator.
And is that business still a healthy business, or is it?
I think for some it will be a healthy business, but it's going to face competition from the usual suspects, the Amazons, the Netflix, Googles, et cetera.
That are disaggregating at the show
That-
level and letting
exactly.
curation happen
Exactly.
in a completely different way. Rick?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think there, you're going to see different gradations of what it is. I think CBS is still going to be CBS, but other people are going to be different and trying to experiment in new and different things. But I do think it's going to be significantly different than what we see right now.
Any dark horse winner that you want to leave us with?
No comment.
No comment. CW. All right. Thank you guys very much. That
Thank
was
you.
a terrific discussion.
Appreciate it.